Alright folks, how's it going? Hope you've been having a good summer. I'm back, Derrick Pratt, the educator at the Erie Canal Museum in downtown Syracuse, with another Cookin on the Canals, part of our Erie Eats, Erie Canal Foodways project, which as always is brought to you with the generous support of the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor and the William G. Pomeroy Foundation. Thank you as always to them, and as always, thank you to the family of Oliver Wendell Petrie, who this series would not be possible without, because they donated Oliver Wendell Petrie's recipe book to the museum, where it now is actually on display in the Erie Eats exhibit at the moment. You can even see it virtually if you can't come into the museum. That recipe book was Oliver's when he was a cook on the barge canal in the late 1930s, and it is a great window into the world he lived in and the culinary world that he existed in and that continues today. And we can learn a lot about history in general and the history of food, and we will hopefully learn a little bit today. But let's get started with some cooking, shall we? I should probably first mention what we're cooking, shouldn't I? Yes, I should. Today, we are making devil's food cake, a tasty dessert. I'm looking forward to it. So, to start off our devil's food cake, we are going to add a half a cup of butter. Ooh, that's been out for a decent amount of time. It's nice and soft. And we are going to then add 2 cups of sugar. Now the recipe calls for these 2 ingredients to be creamed gradually. So I have to use my handy dandy beater here, which is going to be loud and annoying. So I will see you on the other side of that creaming. Okay, and we're back. That was a long and annoying process, but our butter and sugar is nice and creamy. Next, you're going to want to separate your eggs if you make this at home. And we're going to take 4 eggs. And right now we're going to add the yolks, which then have to be beaten again. The recipe says until they are thick and lemon colored, this concoction. So we are going to do that in a second, but first I want to talk a little about the history of devil's food cake. I'm getting ahead of myself here, because devil's food cake, you may have wondered, where does that get its name from? Well, it's a play on a previous dish, which is angel's food cake. Angel's food cake is older. Devil's food cake arises around the turn of the 20th century. Angel's food cake is about 50 to 100 years older, from what we can tell based on recipe books. And it probably originated in the South. It was very popular amongst the African American community down there, and it still continues that popularity today. So I wanted to talk a little about the history of African Americans on the canal, or at least a small slice of that history as it relates to Erie Eats. And there is a very large connection between the food history of the canal and African Americans. You see, as the canal opened up, tons of travelers moved along its banks, business people, tourists, etc. And all of those people needed places to stay, to sleep, and to eat. That sort of thing. Typically, those jobs were not very high status. They were generally marginalized. And we find a lot of the time that African Americans, who themselves were a marginalized population, oftentimes in society, would end up in a lot of these jobs in the food service industry, either as waiters or as cooks. And some great examples of that are a family in the 1830s in Syracuse. That is the family of Thomas and Jane Leonard. They were born into slavery in the 1830s. Not in the 1830s. Before that, they escaped and found their freedom in Syracuse, New York in 1830. And there, Thomas had a number of jobs. He may have even worked as a canal boatman, but he definitely worked as a waiter in the Syracuse House, the most opulent of Syracuse's hotels at the time. His wife Jane worked a few blocks away at the Exchange Hotel as a cook. So we can really see in that example very well how these African Americans along the canal were fitting in to the food culture of the city and the canal at the time. But of course they were doing a lot more than just being waiters and cooks. Jane and Thomas were both active in the Underground Railroad scene, and Thomas in fact played a very crucial role in the 1839 Harriet Powell rescue, in which an enslaved woman was staying at the Syracuse house, and Thomas arranged for this escape attempt that was successful, and Harriet ended up getting to Canada and freedom. So that's a neat little way that Erie Canal food history intersects with much larger trends in American history. So with that said, well, let's get back to cooking, shall we? So I have to beat these again. That is probably going to be another loud and annoying thing, so I will see you once that is done. Okay, and thanks to the magic of YouTube here, our butter, sugar, and egg yolk mix is nice and lemony, as the recipe calls for. Now we move on to the next part of the recipe, and that is going to call for 2.5 cups of flour being mixed with 4 teaspoons of baking powder. Now, of course, I don't have any branded kind of bowls like this, but baking powder's in Black Budding Distillery glass, which is in Rochester, and I can't not mention Rochester, the Flour City. So I'm going to mix those in. And then we've also, in our Syracuse glass, any guesses what's in this? You're right, it's salt. Specifically, 1/4 teaspoon of it. And I'm going to toss that in there. We're going to mix all that baking powder, flour, and salt up into one little mix. Then the recipe calls for that all to be gradually added in. So we'll put some in. I'm going to stir up some of it here. And I'm going to essentially keep repeating this for a while. Wow, this is a lot harder than I thought it would be. So we are going to come back with more in a little bit. Psych! We're not going to be right back after I mix this fully in, because I forgot a crucial step in the recipe. And that is, you need to alternate that flour, baking powder, and salt with milk. We're going to have 1 cup of milk that we're going to alternate in there. All right, so toss in some of that milk, and now, I'm not lying to you this time, trust me. We'll be back after I've mixed everything. Oh, didn't see you there. Well, we have mixed up all those things that we've discussed earlier in the video. So now we're on to the final stage in our devil's food cake preparation. So we are going to add in some already beaten egg whites. Those are from the same 4 eggs that we got the yolks out of earlier. Let's get all that egg white in there. And we are also going to toss in 1 teaspoon of vanilla. Shout out to Rochester again, this time the University of Rochester. And finally, the pièce de résistance. The reason this is devil's food cake, not angel's food cake. And the other exciting bit of food history we have today, and that is melted chocolate. We have, as the recipe calls for, 4 squares of baking chocolate, and that is all going to go right into there. And this is why devil's food cake starts to become a thing around the turn of the 20th century. That's because that is the first time that baking chocolate is readily available to the American public and is able to be kind of mass produced and mass marketed. And we've talked a little about the history of chocolate, I believe, earlier in this series, specifically the Columbian exhibition in Chicago, where Mr. Hershey, I can't remember his first name, but that's not the important part, bought his first chocolate making machine, and that would eventually result in a chocolate making empire, as we all know. So now we got to mix all of this up. Always lick the spoon, folks. Mix that up, and then when we are done here mixing everything, we're going to toss it into this tube pan. I've been informed this is actually a bunt pan, but I don't have a tube pan here, so we'll live. Okay, again, this is proving more difficult than I had initially expected as well. So, I'm actually not going to come back. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the recipe. Maybe we'll come back to show you the results at the end. Once you get all of these things mixed together, you're going to put it evenly into this tube pan and then bake it for 45 minutes. We've preset our oven to 350 degrees. If you've been following along with this series, you know there were no kind of systematized heat measures in Oliver's cookbook, so we did our best guess, and that's what we're going to do. I am pretty confident this is going to be a delicious cake. I just tasted that chocolate. Tastes as good as chocolate normally does. So, thank you as always for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this. I hope that you will try to recreate this recipe as well. We've actually had a few people who shared it on social media. Be sure to tag us, the Erie Canal Museum. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So, I hope you enjoy that. If you enjoyed the story of Jane and Thomas Leonard, I encourage you to check out our Pathways of Resistance walking tour of downtown Syracuse, which looks at the role of African Americans along the Erie Canal in general, and how they played a part in the abolition and Underground Railroad movements. So, with that said, thank you, and have a good rest of your day.